Good afternoon again. I know there are a number of people who have been here yesterday. To those of you who joined us for Etienne Balibar's stupendous lecture. And I want to welcome everyone to this is our second public lecture of the Institute for Critical Social Inquiry's 2019 summer session. And for those of you who don't know, my name is Ann Stoller, the ICSI's founding director. Well, one could imagine after all these years that I've done this, that the task of introducing such an extraordinary range of thinkers as we've been graced to have at the ICSI these 5 years would be just really fun. But it seems that my capacity to describe their breadth and scope seems to be harder and harder every year. And this is particularly so in the case of Achille Mbembe, whose presence we're afforded this afternoon. I love that I can count him, as I can Etienne and Nancy, among cherished comrades, dear friends, and a recurrently unique sort of inspiration. I'm not going to list, I always hate these introductions that list everybody's, they got the NEH and they got a Guggenheim and they got this and what books they've gotten and their accomplishments, since I imagine those of you who are here in a beautiful afternoon in June are here because you have read his fierce prose and sought to think with him. I'd rather like to take this opportunity to say something about his writing and the aesthetics of his political grammar, and why I think he has the capacity to astound us with the simplicity of a sentence and the distilled power of his prose. He sets a new bar for us all, whatever that subject position might be, not only in what we write, but on how we do so. And I think that's a really, really important part of the politics of what Achille offers us. Like Etienne, he has won too many awards and taught in too many places to name. And yes, he's been affiliated with the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg for years and is an annual visiting appointment at Duke. That's all I'm going to say. His Wikipedia sites are replete. The interviews available on the internet abundant. The cascade of books in French and English coming every year. Setting these accolades aside, instead I want to think what this style of thinking does, as he seems to cast an ever more intense light across an ever more capacious horizon of the colony, the post-colony, the empire, the Anthropocene, the planetary, and today in his seminar I heard the cosmos. Across a world in which the principle of separation is so multiplex and so deeply ingrained. For his work is never about and can never be just about the post-colony, tout court. His vision is brazen, refusing the cordoning off of the colony, refusing the making of differently valued humankinds, transgressing scales. Achille may be a philosopher and a political theorist, but these are labels that don't do much more work than authorize people's attention. To my mind, he is much more. Hyperbole aside, you'll think I'm being hyperbolic, but I'm not. He is perhaps, I would argue, the most incisive, brutal, and critical chronicler of what a history of the present looks like from a post-colonial condition, and mercilessly attuned to the changing, icy weapon metrics of what that condition imposes on people and what sorts of dispositions it depends upon, it supports, and it cultivates. He did this 2 decades ago already. And as he remaps the durabilities and these renewals of duress, the planetary carving out of ever more distinctive, differentiated, segregated regimes of space and time today, we follow him through that. Our gift is that he is gifted with a passion for language that does more than produce stunning conceptual innovations like necropolitics. For contained in the term, as Derrida said about powerful concepts that conceal the scenes of their making, is a set of thick histories, which is what I love, that behind that necropolitics is not just a light thing that grazes over the political terrain. It's full of thick histories to which he compels us to turn, with generations of violence strewn along their seams and edges. Achille's affective register is deceptive, it's subversive, it's quiet, and it's bold. The histories he rehearses almost seem like passion plays, colonial parables, with too many resident obscenities in too many places, from the Congo to South Africa to Palestine. But they are never mimetic. They are never the same. He assaults us with their incessant recurrence and with his quiet rage. There is no excess in the writing, but in the iterative acts of violence themselves. Achille produces a writing that does more than expose the unaccountability of imperial governance, and does more than condemn the arbitrary, unpredictable instantiations of how that form of governance has morphed, transfigured, and manifests today. He exposes the inherent violences in quotidian civil society, that which manages to imagine itself set apart from the governing racial logic of how racisms permeate our worlds today. But there is something else in the poetics of rage, measured to sear the skin and close enough to burn the flesh. It's a visceral innovation and invocation. Nothing is immune because it is white immunology, as Odia Butelja might put it, and the fantasy of white immunitas, against which Achille's harshest poesy is aimed. So please join me in welcoming him to speak about technology and eschatology in the computational age. Thank you.
Okay, I very much like what Annie had to say, and I wish she could keep on saying it. And Annie is one of the very rare human beings on earth who, when she calls me, I have no choice but to say yes. I just can't say no to her. But God knows I say no to many people. I am very happy to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to come and contribute to the this year's event with Etienne, who accompanied us once again yesterday, and Nancy, who will deliver the lecture tomorrow. What I have prepared for this lecture is, in fact, I just call them 5 tableaus. 5 tableaus, in reality, a set of urgent, fragmentary, and I would say unfinished reflections on the global present, which was also the main theme of Etienne's lecture yesterday. The question I am preoccupied with is the following. In what ways can we problematize some of the constituent features of these times of ours, this peculiar moment our world is going through, a moment for which there doesn't yet seem to be a a proper name. And since naming our time is part of, I think, what is at stake, I suggest that in the midst of the current dread and confusion, one thing at least is clear. Ours is a time of planetary entanglement, and I would add, technological escalation. So let me say a few things about technology. And here I would like to start with Heidegger. I'm sorry, I just have to start with him. Heidegger, there's just no way in which we can avoid him. Just as yesterday with Etienne, we were reminded of the centrality of Marx in any debate on the becoming of capitalism in our times. So Heidegger was concerned about technology in at least two ways. First of all, he was concerned about technology in terms of what he called its essence, or more precisely, its double essence, that is technology as instrumentum, a means to an end, and technology as an anthropology, that is simply as an activity performed by humans, an activity that set humans apart from other species. Second, he was concerned about technology as in and of itself, and I quote, a way of thinking, end of quote, or to use another one of his formulations, I quote again, a mode of revealing, technology in fact as a certain kind of presence in a specific kind of realm, the realm where, I quote again, and concealment takes place. And concealment takes place, meaning a realm where truth happens, the event of truth. So he was concerned about technology as a way of thinking. But what kind of thinking? A kind of thinking that prepares, and I quote him again, a free relationship to it, to the it meaning technology. Now the question of the essence of technology was of concern for him because he was convinced that our relationship to technology should be one of freedom. Truth and freedom going together in his mind. To experience the technological within its own bounds, he thought, was the only way to open our human existence to its very essence, which is, in his eyes, truth and freedom. Now, such stipulations may seem pretty metaphysical or even theological, secularized theology of technology, which, interestingly enough, borrows a lot from John's Gospel. You know, John's Gospel is somewhat centered around two things. One, the idea that truth is that which will set us free, and love as, in fact, the alpha and the omega of our relationship to ourselves, our community, and to the divine. Maybe this is the reason why Heidegger felt the need to further clarify these stipulations. Indeed, what are we talking about when we invoke terms such as the essence of technology, or when we refer to others such as to experience the technological within its own bounds, or when we suggest that the technological is the event through which truth and freedom come into being and manifest themselves as the ultimate being with capital B and the ultimate dwelling of the human. The question of dwelling, which is not exactly the same as that of the home, which is not exactly the same as that of inhabitation, although there must be somewhere some connection between these three concepts. This is Heidegger's response. I will quote him at length, and then I'll leave Heidegger alone. The essence of technology is by no means anything technological. We shall never experience our relationship with the essence of technology so long as we merely conceive and push forward the technological, put up with it, or evade it. Everywhere we remain unfree and chained to technology, whether we passionately affirm or deny it, but we are delivered over to it in the worst possible way when we regard it as something neutral. For this conception of it, to which today we particularly like to do homage, makes us utterly blind to the essence of technology. Freedom is thus the ground from which the question concerning technology must be posed. Interestingly enough, Heidegger assimilates freedom with something he calls the open. The open is a space where we are neither confined to a stultified compulsion to push on blindly with technology, or what comes to the same, to rebel helplessly against it and curse it as the work of the devil. End of quotation. So it seems to me that Heidegger's insistence to approach the technological from the vantage point of freedom in terms of disclosure and opening and dwelling, this insistence, in fact, characterizes a long tradition in the West when it comes to the relation between humans and artifacts or technical objects. The point I'm making is that he is deeply embedded in this tradition. He is not really, in spite of the metaphysical taste of his discourse, there's no deep rupture between him and the tradition he inherits. It is important to remember all the above because we inherit a tradition of thought, let's call it Western metaphysics, a tradition which, to start with, assumes that there is a division between the technical world of the humans and the natural world of the non-human animals, forgetting thereby that the widespread use of tools among animals is indisputable. Second, it is also a tradition predicated on a myth. The myth is that the Earth's technosphere was brought into being by a particular kind of animal, the human, an animal in possession of a large cognitive capacity, one whose development of language and culture had already liberated it from a purely instinctive relationship with its environment, a relationship one could still see at work in what Lévi-Brühl called the primitive mind, meaning among those original humans who still lived under the rule of animism. Third, the same tradition, Western, just to caricature it, the Western same tradition holds that all the tools, machines, technological artifacts and devices with which humans interact serve to fulfill two key functions, either to replace human action or to respond to human expression or sensation. It is a tradition that harbors at its core two kinds of anxieties, which are still with us. The first is a deep anxiety about the relations between people on the one hand and things on the other, about the relations humans entertain with objects in general and with technical objects in particular. It is a tradition that strives on the deeply held belief that people invent things, but people are not things. It is deeply anxious that there might come a time when the reverse happens, when things take the place of people and people are treated as things. Therefore, it's a tradition haunted by questions such as how much of the human activity should technical objects replace? And since much of the human activity takes shape through the human body, how much of that body should they replace? To what extent should technical objects be made at the image of the human and of that very body? It's an interrogation you find. It saturates that philosophical tradition from the likes of Le Roy-Gourand to likes of Stigler and so forth and so on. And it seems to me that such haunting questions keep lurking behind recent so-called turns, be it the new materialism turn, or for that matter, the object-oriented ontology turn. So in a sense, at least in the so-called Western tradition, we have achieved an almost unparalleled intimacy with machines and technical objects, and yet the deeper this intimacy has become, the more we have nurtured the obsession to keep the borders between the human and that which he or she creates properly policed. Our contemporary intimacy with machines has also exacerbated this anxiety, and it has made identifying the point where machines should end and bodies begin more difficult than ever. There is a second type of anxiety which haunts this tradition and which manifests itself in the form of nostalgia for a time when we could manipulate the environment directly. According to this narrative, technological artifacts have become increasingly autonomous, and our originary self-sufficiency and capacity to direct manipulation of the environment has been taken away from us by our machines. And underlying the nostalgia of a lost relationship with the natural is a characterization of artifacts as threatening, they threaten to dehumanize or enslave us, turning us into extensions of the machines originally intended to serve us. So it's a nostalgia for a return to a time of spontaneous and direct relationship with the natural and the modes of action and perception typical of that epoch. Now, I must say that this anxiety has never been universal. In African pre-colonial worlds and systems of thought, for instance, the impossibility of ever fixing such a boundary between people and things was universally recognized. It was also generally recognized that there will always be some degree of overlap, even reversibility, between the human, his or her body, and the objects he or she invented. That agency was shared between these different entities, and this co-agency was itself a key element in the nurturing of all kinds of vital forces. Finally, it was recognized that agency was tied to flows, not just to humans or to singular events. And this is what was dismissed as animism. So when I read, a number of, I won't give you names, I read them now, I just say, oh, welcome to animism. Welcome back to animism. What was dismissed as animism was the recognition not only of the principle of co-shared agency, but also the recognition of the overlap, as I said, reversibility of bodies and things and objects, and overlap and reversibility, which did not essentialize the body, did not naturalize its modes of sensation and action, but spoke to a different way of accounting for the way we sense and act with objects, the many ways in which the body is not just one more object interacting with other objects and the technologies that surround it. So that's the first tableau. I promised to paint for you 5 tableaus. So we're almost getting there. Now let me move to the second tableau, which has to do with something I call negative messianism. See, animism and then now negative messianism. Negative messianism, in a moment, I have characterized as a moment of escalation. Now, moments of escalation can be genuinely frightening. This is because in the midst of the dread, many suddenly come to the realization that things could get yet uglier. They suddenly awaken to the consciousness that events they always imagined were all but improbable might in fact happen. And they might end up having to go through a lot more than they ever expected or were prepared for. Indeed, throughout the world, including in the wealthiest parts of the globe, part of what strikes me, many are preparing for disaster, are prepping for disaster. A significant number of techies and apocalyptic libertarians in places such as Silicon Valley actually believe that the world is going to end. They are convinced that the human species is moving toward a dark future, an eschatological moment that might signal either the end of its history on earth or the return to some kind of idyllic past. As confidence in freedom and democracy erodes, Etienne spoke about it yesterday, paranoia is increasingly becoming the dominant language both of power and of those who oppose it. Opposition to popular suffrage, to egalitarianism and pluralism is indeed the cornerstone of what is now known as the Dark Enlightenment, a political religion which bemoans what it perceives as the excess of democracy, thus the call for the exit from democratic society and for total corporate and absolute dictatorship. I'm not inventing these things. You can Google them. They are all over the internet. Deploying the familiar tropes of white victimhood, this credo reaffirms the myth of so-called human biodiversity and supposed differences in intelligence across races. It sustains the dreams of a future society integrally run by technology and specifically set aside a part of the world for unregulated experiment. Various quasi-metaphysical dispositions therefore characterize our times. It seems to me that each is underpinned by a particular theology of the future. In the first constellation, it is believed that the future is in the past. In yet another constellation, this particular theology of the future fundamentally opens to nothingness. The belief being that the world is on the road to serfdom and the end is near, destruction is inevitable, and since what is coming will destroy us all anyway, many are asking, why wait? Let's bring it on. Let's just end it all now. Another configuration celebrates the fact that human reason has seemingly reached its limits. The fundamentals of truth can now better be expressed in the form of algorithmic thinking by machines of different kinds capable of making decisions. Many contemporary versions of the Messianic take the form of American prosperity theology. Here, conspicuous consumption is understood as both an act of faith and an investment in one's own future blessings. The dichotomy between the sacred and the profane having been erased, miracles are the stock in trade, spending is turned into a higher calling, and spiritual pathos into gaudy pageantry. Healing miracles are said to be performed, and tumors, sickle cell anemia, emphysema squashed by prayer and daily baptism. I mean, you see it everywhere. See it in Brazil, see it in Argentina, see it in South Africa, in the Congo. People have never prayed as much as they are praying today. They spend huge amounts of time praying. And very important Jewish thinker I keep going back to, Franz Rosenzweig, in his Tower of Redemption, has some really interesting comments on the act of praying. It might be good to resurrect him now and read what I'm describing from that vantage point. In yet another constellation, which combines technophilia and millenarianism, the old quest for immortality is reactivated. The belief is that technology will overcome the brute empirical facts of the human condition, that is, death itself. The later, death, is no longer thought of as irreversible. It is believed that cryonic preservation, which involves, by the way, the freezing of parts of corpses for later resurrection, might open the door for unlimited lifespan. Digital replication of the human mind may eventually be downloaded, and natural, social, and biological limits to self-actualization and self-realization removed. Notwithstanding the false hope that technology will one day revive humans who have been cryonically preserved and vitrified, the times are therefore propitious for negative messianism. Now let me make some brief comments on the concept of messianism. The full force of messianism, I think, resides in the concept of a redemption still to come. The most dramatic instance of redemption in the history of humanity is that of the slave. Messianicity is originally tied to the purchasing of the slave by God. When we look into history of diverse histories of messianicity, that is one thing we can say with conviction. A human being formerly owned by a master, the slave is declared bought by God, who, in retrocessing full value to the captive, effectively redeems him or her. The act of redemption involves a price, and in the Paulinian tradition, for instance, this price is Christ's blood. To free the slave, the ransom is supplied out of God's own blood. That is the kernel of messianicity. Contrary to biblical messianism, contemporary avatars of messianism are not concerned about the fate of the slave of yesterday or the slave of today. Negative messianism is a kind of messianism that has either forfeited the idea of redemption as such, or a messianism which has been reduced to a crude belief in the expiatory power of bloodshed. It is not about salvation. In its minor version, it is about survival and the willingness to sacrifice or to be sacrificed. Its aim is to turn a forgiving God into an ethnic and angry God. In its major version, it is about collective suicide before the apocalypse. In its most tech dystopian instantiation, the future is imagined as an infinite series of stories about an increasingly dangerous and insecure world caught by the thirst to trace and mete out justice and retribution to anonymous and not so anonymous enemies. In any case, retribution against the weakest amongst us. When it does not give rise to a renewed politics of pure violence, and here Etienne has a lot to say to us, in the form of either suicide, martyrdom, or techno-millenarianism, negative messianism paves the way for, or is haunted by apocalyptic fantasies, a messianism of destruction. It seeks not to actually bring about a community, nor does it seek compromise. Rather, it emphasizes purity and self-separation as ways of staving off the disasters of a so-called crack-up civilization. The spirit of the times is not only about survival, it is also about a renewed will to kill, as opposed to the will to care, a will to sever all relationships, as opposed to the will to engage in the exacting labor of repairing the ties that have been broken. So that's the second tableau, and as you can see, it's rather apocalyptico-eschatological. Now the third tableau has to do with what I signaled early on, the return of animism. In a number of areas, including in economics, neoliberalism itself being, in fact, propelled to a large extent by what we can call neo-vitalism. So another key feature of these times of ours is the advent of electronic reason and computational media, as well as the return of animism. And the point I'm trying to make, which is not yet very clear in my own mind, but what I promised to deliver a set of tableaus and unfinished reflections. The point I'm trying to make is that, in fact, there is a connection between the computational and animism. And here, I'm forced to draw from not Heidegger, but from a different archive, an African archive. You see, in old African cognitive worlds, human beings were never satisfied of simply being human beings. They were constantly in search of a supplement to their humanhood. Often, to their humanhood, they added attributes of animals, properties of plants, and various animate and inanimate objects. In a compositional gesture that had nothing to do with the current politics of identity understood as essence. Personhood was therefore not a matter of ontology. It was always a matter of composition and of assemblage of a multiplicity of vital beings. Plants, animals, natural elements being part of these vital beings. To convert one specific object into something else and to capture the force inherent in every single matter and being constituted the ultimate form of power and agency. The world itself was a transactional world. One was always transacting with some other force or some other entity, just as one was always trying to capture some of the power invested in those entities in an effort to add the later to one's originary powers. Now, modernity rejected such ways of being and confined them to, I quote, the childhood of man. Today, the technological devices that saturate our lives have become extensions of ourselves. In the process, a new relationship between humans and other living or vital beings has been instituted. This new relationship is not unlike what African traditions had long prefigured. Not long ago, it was understood that the human person, whom, by the way, the West mistook for the white man, was neither a thing nor an object, nor was he or she an animal or a machine. Human emancipation, Etienne was referring to that term yesterday, was precisely premised on such a distinction. Today, many want to capture for themselves the forces, energies, and vitalisms of the objects which surround us, most of which we have invented. We think of ourselves as made up of various spare or animate parts. How we assemble them and for what purpose is the question late identity politics raises so unequivocally, although the response it proposes leaves a lot to be desired. So the argument I'm making is that neoliberalism has created the conditions for a renewed convergence and at times fusion between the living human being and the objects, artifacts, or the technologies which supplement or augment us. This event, which I am equating to a return to animism, is nevertheless not without danger for the idea of emancipation in this age of crypto-fascism. What does it portend for the future of democracy? Democracy understood not in national terms, but as a kind of planetary and shared responsibility and agency in relation to the future of all inhabitants of the earth, humans and other than humans. We could go on and on this, about this, but let me just leave it at that. And now, move to the next tableau. I'm moving towards the end. Say a few things about discounted bodies, what are called discounted bodies, and the new population question. Etienne called it the law of population. Okay, I call it the new population question. See in a minute what I mean by that. It strikes me that part of what we are witnessing, and we have been talking about it since yesterday, at least in the seminar I have been conducting, part of what we are witnessing at a planetary scale is a novel imbrication, a symbiotic merging of life and mobility. To be alive or to survive is more and more, for many people on earth, coterminous with the capacity to move. Just as living, movement in turn involves continual doublings, the incessant crossing of multiple lines, thresholds, multiple transitions across multiple layers. At the same time, life is itself is more and more taken as something that can be calculated and recombined rather than merely represented. Furthermore, we're witnessing a bifurcation between life on the one hand and bodies on the other hand. Nowadays, not every body is thought of as containing life. Discounted bodies are believed to contain no life as such. They are, strictly speaking, bodies at the limits of life, trapped in uninhabitable worlds and inhospitable places. The kind of life they bear or contain is not insured or is uninsurable, folded as it is in extreme and thin envelopes. Such bodies on the precipice are the most exposed to droughts, to storms and famines, toxic waste, and various experiences of effacement. Their livelihoods made impossible, they are the most likely to sustain the most crippling wounds and injuries. Trapped human subjects, often without escape, they are caught in the various death management systems that saturate the contemporary world. They literally bear the brunt of terrestrial life on a damaged planet. At the same time, they exceed all attempts to contain them. These bodies are not simply in motion, interactive and generative. They are movements and events in and of themselves. The inside of such bodies is not separated from their outward environments, and from the perspective of discounted bodies, to be alive is always and already to breach boundaries or to be exposed to the risk of the outside entering the inside. Such is the case of what you call here black life. Black life in Flint, for instance, exposed to toxic haptic facts. So the disentanglement of life from discounted bodies, this redistribution of life on differential scales of insurability and non-insurability, is a key dimension of contemporary migration regimes. The latter aim at slowing down the dynamics of people interactions, at creating distance, or at shattering the chains of relations between them, so as to institute new patterns of separation. In this model, the restriction of movement does not necessarily aim to confine unwanted people territorially, but to inscribe them into temporalities and specialities that are disjointed to the point of giving these populations the illusion of being territorially apart. Furthermore, at a time when the material components and biological organization of the body can be re-engineered and redesigned, the later bodies are more and more than ever based on the ideas of repressive selection. Only what can potentially generate value now counts as life. In this context, borders are meant to concretize the principle of dissimilarity rather than that of affinity. They are not only obstacles to free movement, they are meant to act as boundaries between species and varieties of the human. As such, they play a crucial role in contemporary modes of production of human difference and relatedness. So in a sense, human bodies are increasingly divided between those that matter and those that do not, those who can move and those who cannot or should not, or should only move under very strict conditions. Bodies that should not move are those that are uninsured. They are kept shifting between invisibility, waiting, and effacement, trapped as they are in fragmented spaces, stretched time, and indefinite waiting, such as is the case in Gaza and in parts of the West Bank. So the processes I'm highlighting leave us with fundamental questions that will haunt us for most of this century. I would now like to offer the last tableau. The first such foundational question is related to contemporary economics of population in the context of what we should call borderization, meaning the logics of containment and closure and contraction. As you know, global perspectives on human mobility are increasingly refracted through those of fertility and mortality. Population politics is once again a cipher for broader geo-racial struggles and new forms of enmity. Improving the species' genetic stock might no longer be the avowed project. Sterilizing the degenerate, the insane, or the criminal might no longer be on the agenda, but treating population as a matrix of different races still saturates contemporary global imaginary. In times of acute racial panic and fears of race suicide, or what is called the Great Replacement, borderization might be the new form of negative eugenics. Perhaps more than at any other moment in our recent past, the population question is framed in terms of whether and how to get rid of certain classes of people deemed redundant or superfluous, what to do with those whose very existence does not seem to be necessary for our reproduction, or those whose mere existence or proximity is deemed to represent a physical or biological threat to our own life. In the context of neoliberal governmentality, the incontinent fecundity of the poor, women or inhabitants of the global south, is opportunistically resurfacing and is now embedded in existential preoccupations concerning the ecological limits of the earth. So to some extent, Malthus is back. Now, throughout history, in response to this foundational question, various paradigms of rules have been designed for human bodies deemed either in excess, unwanted, illegal, dispensable, or superfluous. One of the responses that has been developing since the last quarter of the 20th century and is developing well into first half of the 21st consists in waging wars on speed and on mobility. So I suggest that have new forms of warfare, war against mobility and speed. Wars on mobility are wars whose aim is to turn into dust the means of existence and survival of vulnerable people taken as either invaders or enemies. these kinds of wars of attrition, slow violence, he would say, I forget his name now, Rob Nixon, are methodically calculated and programmed and implemented with new methods, and they are wars against the very ideas of mobility, circulation, speed. The targets of this kind of warfare are not by any means singular bodies, but rather great swaths of humanity. And this kind of war of attrition is going on, and it targets, of course, every organ, which must be specifically incapacitated, in a way that affects generations to come. Now, the second question, foundational question, the processes I have highlighted, second foundational question has to do with the future of reason. And I'll end with this set of reflections on the future of reason. As you know, for a long time, the human race has been concerned with how life emerges, the conditions of its evolution. The key question today is how it can be reproduced, sustained, made durable, preserved, and universally shared, and under what conditions it ends. The question of the end of life is the big question of this beginning of the 21st century. It wasn't always like that. This is new. Overall, these debates about how life on Earth can be reproduced, sustained, and under what conditions it ends, are forced upon us by the epoch itself, characterized as it is by the impending ecological catastrophe and by technological escalation. Now, this is happening at a time when many are gradually coming to the realization that reason may well have reached its limits. Or in any case, it's a time when reason is on trial. Reason is a faculty we used to recognize in humans, and in humans alone. In the Western tradition, we have all, willingly or not, become the inheritors of. Reason was always seen as the highest of all human faculties, the one that opened the doors to knowledge, to wisdom, virtue, and most importantly, freedom. Although unequally redistributed among them, it was the prerogative of humans alone, or so we were told. It distinguished the latter from other living species, and thanks to their superior capacity to exercise this faculty, humans could claim to be exceptional. Today, reason is on trial in two ways. First, it is increasingly replaced and subsumed by instrumental rationality, when it is not simply reduced to procedural or algorithmic processing of information. In other words, the logic of reason is morphing from within machines and computers and algorithms. The human brain is no longer the privileged location of reason. The human brain is being downloaded into nano machines. And an inordinate amount of power is gradually being ceded to abstractions of all kinds. Meanwhile, old modes of reasoning are being challenged by new ones that originate through and within technology in general, and digital technologies in particular, as well as through the top-down models of artificial intelligence. As a result, techne is becoming the quintessential language of reason. Furthermore, instrumental reason, or reason in the guise of techne, is increasingly weaponized. Time itself is becoming enveloped in the doing of machines. Machines themselves do not simply execute instructions or programs, they start generating complex behavior. So the computational reproduction of reason has made it such that reason is no longer, or is a bit more than just the domain of human species. We now share it with various other agents. Reality itself is increasingly construed via statistics, metadata, modeling, mathematics, and many are turning their back to reason in favor of other faculties and other modes of expression and cognition. They are calling for a rehabilitation of affect and emotions, for instance. So in many of the ongoing political struggles of our times, passion is clearly trumping reason. Viscerality rather than reasoning seems to be the order of the day. Now, where does all of this leave us? I have no idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I imagine that there are queries, I imagine, or comments, or whatever you like. Please use these and line up if you like. Or not. It's a hard talk.
So you just want to say amen, if there are no questions.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. Maybe this is what you have been talking about all along, but could you establish any kind of parallelism between necropolitics and this negative messianism?
You want me to talk about necropolitics. And then somebody will stand up and ask me to talk about the postcolony.
The relationship
between what I just said and then necropolitics.
And necropolitics.
Look, if I were to write a text today, I think I would rather direct it along the lines I was sharing with you. It was written long ago, 2003, I think, and since then, our world has been going in different directions simultaneously. I chose to offer 5 specific tableaus, which are not at all indicative of that multidirectionality. These are partisan, it is a very partisan analysis or impressionistic à dessin, and with no ambition at all to describe the current state of the world, with the ambition to share impressions. So I don't want you to get out of here thinking that you have been listening to the gospel. You have been listening to a set of gestures, analytical gestures, attempts at reframing a set of questions which are with us, death worlds being one of those questions. But the connection with the text Necropolitics, you find it in the insistence, the centrality I tried to give to the question of life, of futures of life. As I said briefly, it strikes me that the question of life, of course, is a very complex question. It has a long history. It strikes me, nevertheless, that the 21st century opens on that question. We started on that question, on the question of the durability of our planet, which is the only one we have and the only one we know harbors life possibilities. It strikes me too that the question of life, futures, is at the heart of some of the most dramatic disputes we are likely to see as we proceed. Dispute in particular between those who believe that life is autonomous, that it sustains itself, and those who believe that there are limits to its emergence, reproduction, and sustainability. It happens that among those who argue that life is self-sustaining, which means that eventually means that you can damage it as much as you want, but that in fact it will reproduce itself nevertheless, including under extreme conditions, opens up the possibilities. If that is the case, then look, all this discourse about ecological catastrophe and so forth and so on doesn't hold, because you can damage, but life will still reproduce itself. It seems to me that that's where lies, let's say, some of the big debates of this century, and I would therefore reinterpret necropolitics from that vantage point, and from the vantage point of the planetary, which is not the same thing as the global, which is not the same thing as the universal, which has to do really with the kind of cosmic sensibility we are witnessing, itself having to do with the recognition of the limits of the Earth and the impossibility, in fact, of tracing its borders. So that's one way in which I can answer or comment on your question.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My question is about the tableau about neoliberalism and the new animism. You mentioned that the new animism creates some opportunities for human beings to rework their relationship to technology, and specifically human beings in parts of the world that have been influenced by the Western thought. But maybe I don't want to limit my question to that. But I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how you see that opportunity. I know you said you don't know what to make of all these things, but how are you thinking about that new opportunity that's also a dangerous opportunity in ways that maybe fall into the danger less rather than more?
mean, you see, I don't know what time it is, so I can be a bit relaxed and talk without having. I guess the first thing is to, you see, to just relax in relation to new technologies. If I read them from, I mean, I'm really generalizing, from an African point of view, you understand that there's no African point of view. What I'm saying is that if I use a different archive to think about the ways in which in other social formations, historical social formations, the question of these relationship between humans and what they coexist with, the world they coexist with, if we approach it from within the strictures of a different archive, then the anxieties Heidegger and his sons and daughters carry, we can somewhat put it, not put it to rest, but relax. Just relax. Now, what I was trying to put forward is, okay, you relax, but it doesn't mean there's no danger here. And the danger, or not danger, but the call to rethink a whole set of foundational modes of reasoning in relation to the question of freedom, emancipation, and truth, which Heidegger was interested in, that obligation is in front of us. If we accept that, in fact, the human is only exists insofar as the human is becoming, involved in a process of becoming, involved in a process of becoming which is compositional, that you augment yourself by partaking liberally, partaking of that which surrounds you. The vegetal world, the organic world, the mineral world, the world of animals, you are entangled with those vital beings that are also part of this cosmic environment. What does it do to the belief, for instance, that a human being is not a thing? What does it do to our theories of alienation and reification? How does it force us to rethink all of those key elements which have allowed us to articulate some idea of freedom in these times now? So,
we don't have that much time.
yeah. So it's look, I have opened a can of worms, and that was the project. Yes. The project was not to come here and tell you where to go. The project was to open it and put it on in the open and try to and leave you with that mess.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tamara Brown, and I'm a grad student from SUNY Binghamton. And I really enjoyed your lecture. I found it very thought-provoking, and it also touches upon a lot of things that I'm thinking through. Like, for example, I teach a course called Social Media and Narrative Construction, and I rethink this course every time I teach it. And the last time I taught it, I was thinking about kind of like a critical digital studies, like how technology as we know it has transformed the way we tell stories, who tells them, and what are these stories about. But I want to touch upon a question about the human again. I know it's a very big topic, and hopefully I can, I guess, I guess, respond in some way. But I guess I was thinking about what you said concerning about there are people who have been, who are not satisfied with being human. And for me, it opened up the thought about the kind of politics and the ideology about who's human, right? These concepts are tied to very patterned social ways of being and have economic interests. And how can something be outlived its usefulness when some people are excluded from who's human? And who do you think, who do you attribute this human fatigue to? Is it a group of people who are elites and they have high mobility, right? So they can therefore come in and out of identity and things like that, where some people are still fighting to be acknowledged as human, like Black Lives Matter, right? This idea of racialized, oh, sorry. That was my comment, thank you.
Okay. Can we take another one and then?
Yeah, let's take another one. I think we're
And then we'll finish.
close.
Very good question, thank you. Theology seems to haunt most of what you said today, Messianism, Gospel of John, truth, and you ended up with reason, and reason being on trial. Animism as well being the key. What role do you see for more traditional conceptions of theology? How do you see them partaking in this analysis to these questions that you're proposing? Especially as you open the door to animism and its return in light of technology. I teach theology at Fordham, which is why I'm asking, and I come from a liberationist. I work on borders, but you've given me a whole other conception for the role of theology, and seeking perhaps for your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole other lecture.
It's another lecture, yes, which I'll give when she asks me to come. But after the mess I have made, I'm not sure that she will want me back here. Okay, look, I mean, these are two very serious questions. I just have to take note of them and factor them in what is really a sketch. And maybe when I come back, I'll be able to offer something more specific. Okay, can we just end it here then?
Okay, we can. Very
Thank you.
well.
Thank you very much.
There are times when you just have to end it.